So tell me about your experience in boarding schools.
Boarding schools. I suppose I was unusual in that I went to Catholic boarding schools from the age of 7 to 16. And I have to say I look back with great fondness on those years. The first I went to was St Anthony's in Stony Stratford, a school which is now closed. In fact, it's a very good Indian restaurant now. Where the confessionals were, the bar is now, which is rather nice. But I think those years, those 9 or 10 years, instilled a strong moral compass and a strong work ethic, which I think is with me to this day. And at the age of 16, I was given the choice of remaining in boarding school or going to a mixed-sex state school. And at 16, testosterone basically made the decision in about 1 millisecond. So I went to a state school, a mixed state school, and it was fairly ruinous for my education. With the benefit of hindsight, I had been on track for Oxbridge, but I guess going in a new environment with lots of young ladies and so on didn't do any good for my concentration, in my studies. So I rather fluffed my A-levels and had to retake them, and then did a chemistry degree. Anyway, but it was a very male environment that I grew up in. I also had an elder brother, and I guess it was some years before I realised that men and women really operate in different moral universes. It's something that Alison Tiemann talks about in one of her videos. Basically, her thesis, which I think is very sound, was that men are treated as actors and women as acted upon. So men are held responsible for their actions in a way that women aren't. And we see many manifestations of this. With the benefit of hindsight, I see that women are quite shameless. Not all women, of course, but many women are shameless in pursuing self-interest, and feminists are just the worst at that. We see it also in how the state treats men and women. For example, in the criminal justice system, if men were treated as leniently as women by the courts, 5 out of 6 men in British prisons today wouldn't be there. So gender equality would sort out the prison overcrowding crisis in very short order. But of course, society likes to punish men and be lenient towards women. It's really astonishing how many cases that even we report about, for example, teachers sexually abusing pupils, both male and female pupils, and getting suspended sentences, or perhaps being barred from the profession for a short time. Whereas a male teacher in exactly the same situation could expect, sometimes a considerable prison sentence, and this lack of, if you like, a moral compass and this lack of moral agency manifests itself in lots of ways. For example, one area I'm particularly interested in is the issue of women on corporate boards. Feminists, in particular, have been utterly shameless in driving the narrative that if you have more women on corporate boards, it leads to enhanced financial performance. The evidence base is completely contrary to that. Longitudinal studies tell us that when you increase the proportion of women on corporate boards, corporate performance declines. And yet, year after year, this crazy narrative about women being good for business at the top continues. And the mainstream media reports it all absolutely uncritically. So it's hardly surprising that women, that women carry on in this shameless way, because they frankly get away with it in a way that men never could. In the autumn of 2009, David Cameron, then Conservative Party leader, announced his intention to introduce all-women shortlists so as to drive up the proportion of female MPs. I'd worked for the party between 2006 to 2008 as a business consultant, and I resigned my party membership that day, as did many other Conservative Party members. It was an incredibly unmeritocratic and anti-conservative idea, and it was quietly ditched. But it inspired me to start on a book called David and Goliath, which was published in 2010, and it basically put forward the thesis that David Cameron was simply pursuing the same feminist agendas as women like Harriet Harman, and he continued that when in power. So in 2010, he became Prime Minister at the head of a coalition government, and within weeks appointed Lord Davis of Abersock, a Labour peer, to produce a report on how to increase the proportion of women on major corporate boards. The ridiculous Davis report was published in early 2011, and one of its key recommendations, which was accepted by the government, was that if the FTSE 100 companies hadn't achieved 25% female representation on their boards by 2015, the government should be minded to introduce gender quota legislation. The FTSE 100 duly increased the number of women on their boards, virtually all of them non-executive directors rather than directors, which tells you something in itself. But in 2012, more and more evidence was coming forward from longitudinal studies from Norway and elsewhere to show that when you drive up the proportion of women on corporate boards artificially, whether through quotas or the threat of them, corporate performance declines. And it's not particularly a gender point. You know, if companies took any cohort of people and artificially increased their numbers on the board, exactly the same thing would happen. So in 2012, I formed the Campaign for Merit in Business, which remains to this day the only organisation in the world challenging a government over this policy direction of increasing women on boards. And again, in 2012, I engaged with House of Commons and House of Lords inquiries. I presented evidence from 5 longitudinal studies showing that pushing more women onto boards leads to corporate decline. The MPs and the peers listened to it all politely and took not the blindest bit of notice. About 12 months later, in very early 2013, I thought, well, I'm just banging my head against a brick wall here. If rational arguments and facts don't change government policy, what on earth can you do? And it occurred to me that it came to me out of the blue that the thing I could do was to form a political party. So I launched Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them in early 2013, about 3.5 years ago, and it's been an interesting 3.5 years. Men have been trying for 30 years to use rational arguments to quash the myths, and yet the myths keep coming. There's a lot of employment created by feminist myth making. A lot of women are professionally invested in it, and the mainstream media simply never call them out. And whether that's due to laziness, feminist influence in the mainstream media, there's probably a number of factors. The gender pay gap is one of those awful feminist myths that simply will not die. It's largely because women have gone more into further education than men in the last decade or two. The only gender gap beneath 40 is in favour of women, but you'll never find that in the mainstream media. The reasons for a gender pay gap in favour of men arising after the age of 40, the reasons are perfectly well understood, and they're virtually all down to different choices made by men and women. Women, once they've had children, tend to be less career focused, and we'd expect that. But you have to ask yourself, where does this idea come from that we should have, let's say, parity on company boards and in the senior levels of organisations? And it's just crazy because men and women typically have different work ethics, different relationships to the world of work. In the year 2000, Dr. Catherine Hackim, a world-renowned sociologist, produced a paper on what she called preference theory. Her research showed that while 4 in 7 British men are work-centred, only 1 in 7 British women is work-centred. So you would expect something like an 80-20 balance at the top of companies and all, and so on. But the women who are driving all these agendas, who are complaining about the gender pay gap and so on, almost invariably come from the 1 in 7 cohort of women. They're work-centred. They very often don't have children. A fairly high proportion of them are lesbians, and they're simply untypical of women in general. So, I mean, it is not a problem that there are few women in senior levels of organisations. Women in general just do not want the stress and the responsibility that comes with those sorts of lines of work, with seniority. Very often they have a decent standard of living on account of their partners, and it's very few men that have the option of having a great work-life balance with a high-earning woman financing that option. And we know from a number of studies that even as women, go more into the workplace and they earn more, their preference for partners is still for men who earn more. It's called hypergamy, and it's not something that's women do not like to fund men to stay at home as house husbands, despite feminist rhetoric. I mean, something that feminists absolutely hate is the scientific reality that there are significant differences between the brains of gender-typical men and gender-typical women. And there was a very good book written, I think, in 2005 by Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, a psychologist at Cambridge University. And his thesis is basically that men's brains are hardwired for systemizing, for understanding and improving systems. So we shouldn't be surprised that men like to go into areas like mathematics, physics, engineering, and excel at those. And even today, there are few women that like to enter those lines of work. Women, on the other hand, according to Baron-Cohen, their brains are more hardwired for empathizing. So we would expect them to go into the caring professions, and sure enough, they do in huge numbers. So in terms of, let's say, caring, over 90% of psychologists are women. Something like 70% of medical students are women. All the evidence bears out Simon Baron-Cohen's thesis, I think. But I think the men's rights advocates are getting to realise that there's no point year after year just trotting out rational arguments and producing facts, because they have absolutely no impact on the gender debate. The assaults on men's and boys' human rights get worse by the year, despite all the arguments put forward. So men's rights advocates are increasingly thinking, what else can we do? And in my case and the case of my colleagues, we're looking for a political solution. Because we think, while you can't destroy the evil ideology of feminism through arguments, the power of feminism can be thwarted politically and practically, in our view. So at the 2020 general election, we intend to field 20 candidates in the top 20 Conservative marginal seats, because the Conservatives have been every bit as bad as previous Labour administrations in their anti-male policies and their, how they run government. They've done nothing, for example, for fathers denied access to their children. They were at one time, the Conservatives were at one time the party of the family, and those days have long gone. So we're intending to, or we're planning to stand in the top 20 Conservative marginal seats, with a view to ensuring that as many as possible of those 20 aren't re-elected in 2020. In almost all cases, the runner-up is Labour. So as well as denying a Conservative MP a re-election, we'll be helping a Labour MP to get elected, and that could lead to a very significant differential, which could change the outcome of the election. And I should say, it's not that we're anti-conservative, far from it. Most of our policy positions, I guess you could call socially conservative. But we're simply, as a matter of policy, always challenging the party or parties in power, because it's only those party or parties that have the power to stop the assaults on men's and boys' human rights. In my view, the most destructive aspect of feminism has been the attack on the nuclear family. Feminism springs from Marxism, and as we might expect, both Marxism and feminism were both very antagonistic towards the nuclear family. I'd strongly recommend people read a book called Their Angry Creed by Herbert Purdy, which in forensic detail spells out exactly how the destruction of the family in the developed world has come about. Something like 50%, for some years, something like 50% of marriages have ended in divorce. And women file for divorce in about 3/4 of those cases. It's a route to personal enrichment very often. Women come away very often with not only huge amounts of money and property earned by their former partner, but very often property and money that he's inherited. It's basically state-sponsored mugging of men by women, so it's hardly surprising that women resort to it. The amount of human suffering that is caused by denial of access between children, fathers, and paternal grandparents is really appalling. And it's a major driver of male suicide, and the male suicide rate is over 3.5 times the female suicide rate. And yet, men are exhorted to talk about their problems. Well, what's the point of talking about the fact you cannot see your children? It just tears the scab off the wound every time. It is it doesn't help at all. The state, rather than denying fathers and paternal grandparents access to children, should be ensuring it. For example, any woman who denies, who thwarts a contact order. Between her children and their father, should be locked up for a substantial time. It is incredibly cruel to both the children and the fathers. Feminism has always been an evil ideology. The idea that modern feminism has problems or is troublesome in some way, but historically feminism was a good thing, I think I'd challenge very strongly. In 1913, so a little more than a century ago, a Marxist philosopher called Ernest Belford Bax wrote a book called The Fraud of Feminism. And he'd been writing about feminism at least 20 years before that. And and he demonstrates in his book that feminism is not about gender equality, it's about the extension of female privilege. And if you go, let's say, to the early years of the century, probably a little more than half the men who were killed or maimed in the trenches and otherwise in World War I didn't have the vote. And the only reason men got the vote in 1918 was that the country was virtually bankrupt, and the government had no choice but to increase the tax base. And it really couldn't demand of men who'd been through those awful sacrifices that they pay tax without representation. So that's how men got the vote in 1918. And it was only 10 years. It was only 10 years after that before women got the vote on the same basis without sacrificing anything. It's another of the great feminist myths that the suffragettes basically won women the vote. And you only have to read Steve Moxon's book, The Woman Racket, to understand that suffragettes delayed female emancipation rather than accelerate it. But it's just one of countless feminist myths that, through repetition, is believed by the general public. Something that's been a problem for people interested in men's rights for some time has been knowing how to associate with other men who are interested in the same areas. And just a few months ago, somebody unconnected with us started an initiative called Network for Men, and I think the website is networkformen.org. And I'd strongly recommend that people check it out and register. And they've already had cases of men who've registered in given towns, and they've had people just from a few doors away also registering. It's really quite extraordinary. So it's really, really important that men meet, in a supportive environment to talk about all these issues and work out how to better defend men's rights and how to better challenge feminism. I have a website called menshouldn'tmarry.wordpress.com. marriage has become utterly toxic for men, and the fact that men keep on marrying and getting destroyed through the process is really quite shocking. If I had a son and I was going to give him a few words of advice, I think I'd encapsulate it in just a few words, just a couple of words. Don't marry.
Yes. Okay.
I'm sure there's lots more, but that's
Yeah.
You're not married, are you?
No.
No, you kind of look happy.
Yeah.
And I can tell married men because they're kind of like crushed.
Yeah,
They've had their cojones sort of cut off, and go on.
I've got a couple of friends, and I've noticed this about them. The wife sucks out of them.
Marriage takes a marrow out of your bones. It really does.